She spent 5 agonizing years masking her scent with bitter ash and crushed wolfsbane, living as a simple healer in the muddy outskirts of the king's own forest. She thought her past was buried forever, until a wounded alpha king crashed through her door, bleeding, growling, and instantly murmuring the word, mate. The year was 1348, and the village of Briar Ridge was a miserable rain-soaked settlement, clinging to the edge of the vast, unforgiving hemlock forests. It was a place where peasants died of winter fever, and where secrets were easily buried in the thick, unyielding mud. For Genevieve Caldwell, it was the perfect place to disappear. To the local villagers, Genevieve was nothing more than a quiet, remarkably skilled apothecary. She was a woman who kept her gaze, lowered her hair, wrapped tightly in a linen wimple, and her hands permanently stained with the green sap of medicinal herbs. But beneath the homespun wool and the heavy scent of crushed garlic and dried lavender she wore daily, Genevieve was a fugitive. She was a werewolf, and not just a common beta. She was the last surviving heir of the Northern Frost Claw Pack, a lineage thought to have been entirely eradicated 5 years prior. The massacre had been swift and merciless. A rogue faction funded by mysterious Southern gold and led by a tyrant named Gideon had slaughtered her parents in their own great hall. Genevieve had survived only because her mother had shoved her through a hidden servants' chute, screaming at her to run and never shift again. For half a decade, Genevieve had obeyed. She suppressed her inner wolf with agonizing, near-lethal doses of a toxic wolfsbane tea. It made her violently ill, but it kept her fangs retracted, her eyes a dull human brown, and her scent masked from the predatory patrols that still roamed the continent, looking for stragglers. She had chosen Briar Ridge because it sat squarely in the territory of King Alistair of House Hemlock. Alistair was the Alpha King of the South, a legendary and ruthless ruler who had unified the warring southern packs through sheer unadulterated power. His territory was the last place Gideon's assassins would ever dare to search. It was the safest place in the world for Genevieve provided. She remained absolutely invisible. But destiny, much like a starving wolf, rarely respects a hiding place. It happened on the eve of the winter solstice. The sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple, and a punishing blizzard was beginning to bury the village. Genevieve was in her small, draughty hovel, grinding dried comfrey root by the light of a single tallow candle. The sudden explosive pounding on her heavy oak door made her jump the mortar, slipping from her hands and shattering on the hard-packed dirt floor. Before she could unlatch the iron bolt, the door was practically torn from its hinges. The brutal winter wind howled into the room, bringing with it a flurry of snow and the suffocating coppery stench of fresh blood. 3 massive men staggered over her threshold. They were clad in blackened steel and heavy, fur-lined cloaks that were now shredded and soaked in crimson. But it was the man they were carrying between them that caused Genevieve's heart to stop dead in her chest. He was colossal, built like a fortress of muscle and sinew, with long dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat and snow. His armor had been violently rent open, exposing a chest crisscrossed with deep, jagged lacerations. But these were not ordinary wounds. The edges of the torn flesh were sizzling, smoking with a faint, sickening hiss. Silver. He had been struck by weapons forged of pure silver. Healer. One of the guards roared, his eyes glowing with the unmistakable golden flare of a shifted wolf. "Help him, or we will tear you limb from limb." Genevieve's breath hitched. Her inner wolf, dormant and poisoned for 5 years, suddenly slammed against her ribcage with a force that made her gasp. A terrifying, intoxicating scent rolled off the wounded man, cutting through the smell of blood and wet fur. It was the scent of lightning, crushed pine needles, and raw, untamed authority. It was the Alpha King himself, Alistair. And as he was laid upon her meagre wooden table, his head rolling back to expose the thick, pulsing veins of his throat, her suppressed wolf howled into the dark recesses of her mind. The connection struck her like a physical blow, a tether of pure, crackling energy snapping into place. Mate. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Genevieve's veins. If she was caught here, if the Alpha King discovered that his fated mate was the hunted princess of the North, she would be dragged into a war she could not win. Worse, if his guard sensed her true nature, they might execute her on the spot as an enemy spy. "Put him down quickly," Genevieve ordered, forcing her voice to tremble, just enough to mimic a terrified human peasant. She rushed to her cupboards, her hands flying over jars of herbs, deliberately grabbing handfuls of pungent, overwhelming spices to rub onto her own wrists and neck, desperate to hide the sudden sweet scent of a female wolf finding her mate. She turned back to the table. Alistair's skin was pale sweat, beading on his sharp, aristocratic cheekbones. The silver was poisoning his blood, fighting his unnatural healing abilities. If the shrapnel wasn't removed within the hour, even an Alpha King would perish. She had to save his life, even if it meant risking her own. The fire in the hearth roared as Genevieve worked frantically. She had ordered the king's guards outside to stand watch, insisting that the scent of their panic and their shifting wolves was contaminating the air and making it impossible for her to concentrate. Reluctantly, they had obeyed the human healer, leaving her alone with the most powerful werewolf in the realm. Her hands, usually steady, shook violently as she took a pair of iron tongs and sterilized them in the flames. Alistair's chest was a ruin of torn muscle. With excruciating care, she dug into the seared flesh, pulling out tiny, barbed fragments of silver. Every time she extracted a piece, the king's massive frame convulsed a low, guttural growl, vibrating from his chest that made the wooden floorboards tremble. Each sound he made sent a shockwave of instinctual obedience and deep, burning desire through Genevieve's hidden wolf. She was biting the inside of her cheek so hard that she tasted her own blood, focusing the pain to keep herself from shifting right there beside him. After an agonizing hour, the last piece of silver clattered into a wooden bowl. Genevieve quickly packed the wounds with a thick paste of yarrow honey and ground white willow bark to draw out the remaining infection, then bound his chest tightly with clean linen. Exhausted, she slumped into a chair beside the table, wiping sweat from her brow. Suddenly, a massive hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist like an iron vise. Genevieve gasped. Alistair's eyes had snapped open. They were not the dull, pain-filled eyes of a dying man. They were molten gold, burning with an intense predatory focus. He didn't speak, but he dragged her wrist closer to his face, his chest heaving as he took a deep, shuddering breath. He was inhaling her scent. Genevieve's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had coated herself in garlic, bitter ash, and lavender, but an Alpha King's senses were unparalleled. Alistair's thick eyebrows drew together in a dark scowl. Confusion rippled across his harsh, devastatingly handsome features. Beneath the overwhelming stench of the peasant apothecary's herbs, his wolf was catching the faintest ghostly whisper of something divine. Wild flowers and fresh snow. It was a scent that made the brutal, warlike beast inside him want to instantly submit and purr. "Who are you?" Alistair rasped his voice, a deep, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "I am Jenny, my lord." She lied smoothly, keeping her eyes downcast in the customary submission of a human to a werewolf lord. I am just a widow, a simple healer of Briar Ridge. Alistair's grip tightened fractionally. He didn't believe her. His wolf was clawing at the edges of his consciousness, demanding that he pull this frail, trembling human into his arms and bury his face in her neck. It made no sense. He was the Alpha King. He did not have human mates. Yet looking at her dirt-smudged face, he felt an unprecedented, violent possessiveness. Before he could interrogate her further, the heavy oak door flew open once again. "My king!" A tall, impeccably dressed nobleman strode into the room, flanked by 4 elite guards. He brushed the snow from his luxurious sable cloak, his aristocratic face arranged into an expression of deep, exaggerated concern. "Thank the goddess we found you. When the hunting party was ambushed, I feared the worst." Genevieve shrank back into the shadows of the corner, keeping her head bowed. But as the nobleman stepped into the firelight, her breath caught in her throat. It was Lord Reginald Montgomery, the king's most trusted adviser, the hand of the Southern Court. Genevieve recognized him instantly, not from Southern tapestries, but from a night of fire and screaming 5 years ago. Running from the corner of Montgomery's left eye down to his jawline was a thick, jagged white scar. It was a scar her father, the Northern Alpha, had given him right before Montgomery unlocked the gates of their ancestral keep, allowing Gideon's assassins to flood inside. Montgomery wasn't just an advisor to King Alistair. He was the traitor who had orchestrated the downfall of her family. And now he was standing in her kitchen. The realization hit Genevieve with the force of a falling portcullis. The ambush in the woods today hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been rogue bandits. It was an assassination attempt orchestrated by Montgomery himself. The traitor was trying to kill the Alpha King, to seize control of the South, just as he had helped destroy the North. "I will survive Montgomery," Alistair said, coldly pushing himself up onto his elbows, wincing as his freshly bound wounds stretched. Though it seems the bandits were remarkably well armed. They used silver shrapnel, a rather expensive commodity for common thieves. Montgomery's expression didn't waver, but Genevieve noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. "A thorough investigation will be launched at first light, my king. For now, we must move you back to the royal stronghold. This hovel is not fit for a monarch." He cast a look of utter disdain toward Genevieve. As Montgomery's cold grey eyes swept over her, he paused. He tilted his head, his gaze lingering on the curve of her jaw, the shape of her brow beneath the linen wimple. A flicker of recognition, faint but dangerous, passed through his eyes. "Have we met, apothecary?" Genevieve kept her eyes glued to the dirt floor, forcing her hands to stop trembling. "No, my lord. I have never left the borders of Briar Ridge." "She stays!" Alistair suddenly commanded, his voice echoing with absolute alpha authority, forcing every wolf in the room, including Genevieve, to physically freeze. "I am not moving until the silver poisoning has fully passed. The healer stays by my side. All of you will make camp outside." Montgomery's eyes flashed with annoyance, but he bowed deeply. "As you wish, my king." As the traitor turned and walked out the door, Genevieve realized the terrifying gravity of her situation. She was trapped in a tiny cabin with her fated mate, an Alpha King, who was slowly realizing she wasn't entirely human, and a traitorous lord who was actively trying to murder him. If Montgomery recognized her, he would silence her to protect his secrets. If Alistair discovered her lies, he might execute her. She had spent 5 years hiding in the shadows. Now the deadliest game in the kingdom was being played right in her living room, and Genevieve had to decide whether to keep running or finally bare her fangs. The blizzard outside the tiny apothecary cabin raged with a terrifying ferocity, rattling the wooden shutters and forcing freezing drafts through the chinks in the mud-daubed walls. Inside, the heavy silence was broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the deep, rhythmic breathing of King Alistair. Genevieve sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the flames cast long, dancing shadows across the king's sleeping form. Montgomery and his men had retreated to the relative shelter of the village inn, leaving 2 sentries stationed at the edge of the woods. They assumed the king was incapacitated, slowly succumbing to the silver poisoning, guarded only by a frail human widow. They were gravely mistaken, but Genevieve had a far more pressing problem than the traitorous Lord Montgomery. Her veins felt as though they were filled with liquid fire. The intoxicating scent of her fated mate, combined with the extreme stress of the evening, was actively tearing through the chemical barricade she had built inside her body. For 5 years, she had relied on a meticulously brewed tincture of crushed wolfsbane monkshood and bitter ash to suppress her northern alpha blood. The potion was highly toxic. It kept her wolf comatose and her scent completely neutralized, but it required a strict daily dosage. If she missed even a single night, the suppression would fail. Her true nature would burst forth, her scent would bloom, and every wolf within a 10-mile radius would know exactly what she was. Her hands trembling violently, Genevieve crept toward her supply cabinet. She needed to brew the tea immediately. The pain in her bones was escalating a sharp, aching pressure as her skeleton prepared for a shift it had been denied for half a decade. She placed a small iron kettle over the coals, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She measured the dried wolfsbane, a lethal dose for any normal human, but just enough to paralyze her inner beast. As the water began to simmer, emitting a harsh, acrid vapor, a deep voice suddenly shattered the quiet of the room. "That is no healing draught, apothecary." Genevieve froze, the wooden spoon slipping from her fingers. She turned slowly. Alistair was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, his golden eyes glowing brightly in the dim light, tracking her every movement. The silver infection had been drawn out by her poultice, and his supernatural healing was already knitting the torn flesh of his chest together. "It is a remedy for my own ailments." "My lord," Genevieve stammered frantically, trying to push the kettle deeper into the flames. "A draught for joint pain." "You lie." Alistair rumbled his voice, dark and dangerous. He swung his heavy legs off the table, wincing slightly, but ignoring the pain with a terrifying display of willpower. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I have fought in the northern campaigns. I know the scent of burning wolfsbane. It is poison, a human drinking that would be dead before the cup hit the floor." Panic clawed at Genevieve's throat. She backed away until her spine hit the rough wood of the cabinet. "My lord, please, you must rest." "Who are you?" Alistair demanded, closing the distance between them. His immense frame towered over her, radiating a suffocating wave of pure, unfiltered alpha command. "My wolf recognizes you. It demands I protect you. Yet my eyes see a peasant, and my nose smells bitter ash and garlic. What kind of sorcery is this?" Before Genevieve could formulate another lie, a sharp, unnatural sound cut through the howling wind outside. It wasn't the storm. It was the faint, wet thud of a body dropping into the snow. Alistair's ears twitched. His golden eyes snapped towards the heavy oak door. The romantic tension instantly evaporated, replaced by cold, lethal instinct. "Someone is outside," he whispered, stepping protectively in front of Genevieve. The latch of the door began to lift so slowly that it barely made a sound. Montgomery hadn't waited for the silver to finish the job. He had sent an assassin. The door swung open, revealing a towering figure wrapped in a black cloak, a wicked, silver-coated short sword gleaming in his hand. It was one of Montgomery's elite guards, his eyes flashing with the beta gold of a shifted wolf. Seeing the king standing upright, the assassin snarled and lunged forward. Alistair roared, moving to intercept, but his body betrayed him. The lingering weakness from the silver poisoning caused his knee to buckle. He crashed into the wooden table, leaving his flank entirely exposed. The assassin raised the silver blade, aiming straight for the king's neck. In that fraction of a second, the suppressed, poisoned wolf inside Genevieve broke its chains. 5 years of agonizing suppression shattered. Her bones cracked and realigned with a sickening crunch. The wimple tore from her head as thick, silver-white fur erupted across her skin. She didn't shift fully, there wasn't time, but she allowed the partial transformation, her human nails elongating into razor-sharp, lethal talons, her brown eyes flashing to a blinding glacial ice blue. With a feral, deafening snarl that shook the dust from the rafters, Genevieve launched herself across the room. She hit the assassin with the force of a battering ram, her enhanced speed and strength catching the beta completely off guard. They crashed into the far wall, shattering the apothecary shelves. The assassin slashed wildly with the silver blade, opening a shallow cut across Genevieve's forearm, but she barely felt the burn. Acting on pure protective instinct for her mate, her hand shot out her claws, sinking deeply into the assassin's throat. With one brutal, decisive twist, she crushed his windpipe. The beta crumpled to the floor, dead. Genevieve stood over the body, her chest heaving, her talons dripping with blood. The acrid scent of the boiling wolfsbane had been completely obliterated. In its place, filling every corner of the tiny cabin, was the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of fresh snow and wild alpine flowers. She turned slowly to face Alistair. The Alpha King was staring at her entirely breathless, his golden eyes wide with profound shock and sudden, desperate reverence. Goddess above, Alistair breathed, falling to one knee, not out of weakness, but in absolute awe. "You are not a peasant. You are a northern royal." The howling wind outside seemed to pale in comparison to the heavy electric silence within the cabin. Genevieve stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she fought the feral instincts surging through her blood. Slowly she forced her claws to retract her breathing, to steady, and the silver-white fur to recede back into her skin. But her eyes remained that striking, undeniable ice blue. "My name," she said, her voice no longer trembling, but ringing with the clear, melodic authority of a highborn, "is Genevieve Caldwell, daughter of Alpha Roland of the Frost Claw Pack, and you, King Alistair, are currently bleeding on my floor." Alistair rose to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his chest. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. The Frost Claw Pack had been massacred 5 years ago. The entire bloodline was believed to be extinct. Yet here stood the lost princess, hiding in the mud of his own kingdom. "Caldwell." Alistair repeated the name, tasting heavy on his tongue. He took a step toward her, the mating bond pulling at him with the gravity of a dying star. "You survived the purge. Why did you not come to the Southern Court for sanctuary? I would have protected you." Genevieve let out a bitter, cynical laugh. "Protect me? Your most trusted advisor, Lord Reginald Montgomery, is the very man who unlocked the gates of my family's keep. He orchestrated the slaughter of my parents, Alistair. He took northern gold from the tyrant Gideon, and now he intends to take your throne." Alistair's expression darkened into a mask of pure murderous rage. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. The ambush in the woods, the suspiciously expensive silver weapons, and now an assassin sent in the dead of night. Montgomery had been playing a long, treacherous game. He thought the silver would weaken me enough for this cur to finish the job, Alistair growled, kicking the lifeless body of the assassin at his feet. He looked back at Genevieve, his golden eyes softening as they swept over her face, drinking in her true appearance without the grime and the heavy wimple. She was breathtaking, and instead he led me directly to my mate. Genevieve's breath hitched. Hearing him say the word aloud sent a shiver of pure electricity down her spine. Alistair, if Montgomery finds out I am alive, he will not stop until both of us are dead. Let him try, Alistair said, stepping into her space and gently taking her blood-stained hands in his massive warm ones. He believes me weak. He believes you are a mere human. Tomorrow morning we will show him exactly what happens when you corner a king and a northern alpha. The rest of the night was spent in a tense, strategic vigil. Under Genevieve's expert care, Alistair's wounds closed completely by dawn. They planned their next move meticulously, knowing that the morning light would bring Montgomery and his treason directly to their doorstep. When the sun finally breached the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over the snow-covered village of Briar Ridge, the heavy sound of marching boots crunched outside the cabin. The door was thrown open. Lord Montgomery stepped inside, flanked by 6 heavily armed beater guards. He wore a smug, self-satisfied smile, clearly expecting to find his king's corpse. What a tragedy! Montgomery began, his voice dripping with false sorrow, before his eyes adjusted to the gloom. The words died in his throat. Alistair was not dead. He was seated upon the wooden chair as if it were a throne, his broad chest bare, and fully healed, his golden eyes blazing with lethal authority. But it was the woman standing at his right side that made the blood drain entirely from Montgomery's face. Genevieve no longer wore the oversized, muddy rags of a peasant. She stood tall, her posture immaculate, wearing a cloak fashioned from the pelt of a slain winter bear she had kept hidden beneath her floorboards. Her ice-blue eyes locked onto Montgomery, and she unleashed her full, unbridled alpha aura. It slammed into the guards like a physical wall, forcing 3 of them to instantly drop to their knees, whining in submission to the overwhelming pressure of 2 royal alphas standing side by side. Lord Montgomery, Genevieve said, her voice slicing through the cold air like a freshly sharpened blade. You look as though you have seen a ghost. Genevieve. Caldwell. Montgomery choked out, instinctively taking a step backward. Impossible. You burned with your father. You are guilty of high treason, Montgomery. Alistair's voice boomed, rattling the windows. He stood up, his royal aura pinning the remaining guards to the spot. You conspired with Gideon to slaughter the northern royals, and you conspired to assassinate your king. Your crimes end today. Kill them! Montgomery shrieked, drawing his own sword, his composure entirely shattered. Kill them both! But his guards didn't move, caught between the terrifying command of the Southern King and the chilling ancient power of the northern air. Their loyalties fractured. Seeing his men paralyzed by fear and submission, Montgomery let out a desperate cry and lunged toward Genevieve, hoping to strike her down before Alistair could intervene. He never made it halfway. Alistair moved with blinding, supernatural speed. He intercepted Montgomery, catching the traitor's sword arm by the wrist. With a sickening snap, he broke the lord's arm, sending the silver blade clattering to the floor. In the same fluid motion, Alistair drove his hand into Montgomery's chest, ripping the traitor's life away before he could even draw another breath. Montgomery's body hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, mirroring the assassin from the night before. The remaining guards immediately prostrated themselves, pressing their foreheads to the dirt, begging for mercy. Alistair ignored them. He turned his back on the carnage and walked toward Genevieve. The air between them crackled with adrenaline and undeniable destiny. He reached out gently, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a cascade of warmth through her weary soul. The shadows are no longer yours to bear. Genevieve, Alistair murmured, his voice softening only for her. He turned to face the trembling guards at the door, his voice echoing out into the crisp morning air, loud enough for the entire village to hear. Hear me. Return to the capital and prepare the High Court. Lord Henry Beaufort shall take temporary command of the southern garrisons. Alistair commanded. He pulled Genevieve flush against his side, intertwining his fingers with hers. Prepare the royal chambers, for I bring home not just my fated mate, but the rightful queen of the north. The realms are finally united. Genevieve Caldwell stepped out of the tiny apothecary cabin, and into the blinding sunlight, no longer a hidden fugitive, but a queen ready to reclaim her stolen legacy beside the most powerful alpha in the realm. Their enemies would soon learn that the most dangerous wolf is the one who has learned to survive in the shadows. Loved this thrilling tale of betrayal, destiny, and fated mates? Hit the like button, share this story with your fellow romance lovers, and absolutely subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding, immersive werewolf audio dramas every single week.